I'm going to do some examples of taking equations and typesetting them so that they work in Python and also so that they are correctly formatted. I'm going to start with x equals 2y. So this equation is going to give me problems if I try to run it in Python. You can see that there's a syntax error. Python does not understand 2y. It does not understand that this is 2 multiplied by y. So we always have to insert multiplication, even though we can read an equation without that inserted. And then if we insert the multiplication, Python does not give a syntax error, but it does give an error because it can't make the calculation since we haven't provided a value for y. In order to test this, not to make this equation validly formatted, but to test it, we do have to give y a value to see if everything runs. And then if we want to make sure that the equation evaluated correctly, over here in the shell, we can just type x and just see what the value ends up being, which is 10. And that's good because y is 5, so 2 times 5 is 10. If you want to typeset 2y in Python, this is the way to make it work in terms of syntax. We also do care about formatting, and one of the formatting rules for equations is that you always want to put spaces around the equal sign. You also do want to put spaces around the lowest priority operation, which is the last operation that is going to be performed when Python is calculating whatever it's calculating. Here I could put spaces around the multiplication because that's the last operation that will be performed. However, in a situation like this where there's literally only one operation, it really doesn't matter all that much that I put spaces around the multiplication. And that's just because the spaces are there for readability purposes. And if there's just one operation, it's still pretty readable. If we were to do something like this second example, then the spaces around the lowest priority operation do make a lot more sense. Here we have 7x squared divided by 2 plus 4. And we're going to format this correctly and make it work with Python's syntax. The lowest priority operation that's going to happen here is the addition, the plus 4. And by inserting spaces around that, you can see that this is a little more readable already, in the sense that when you first look at this equation, it might look like you're dividing by all of 2 plus 4. I mean, we know how parentheses work, we know that that's not the case, but separating out the 4 just makes it a little clearer to someone who's reading through the code quickly that you're going to do the division and everything else first and then add 4 at the end. 7x won't be read by Python. We have to do 7 times x. And then also Python doesn't recognize exponents with this symbol, the up arrow or the caret. It does exponents with a double star. So x star star 2 means x squared. So I had to replace that symbol with 2 stars in order to make Python read this. And then again, I'm going to run this. I won't get any syntax errors, but it can't compute what I'm doing because I didn't provide a value for x. So let's do x equals 10. And then if we run it and see what we get for y, we end up with 354. And that does make sense because 10 squared is 100. 100 times 7 is 700. Divide that by 2, you get 350, and then add 4 to it to get 354. This makes sense. The value y is what we expect. Realistically, if you're thoroughly testing code, you do want to do a lot more tests than just plugging in one number. But since these equations are relatively straightforward and I have experience writing Python code, I feel comfortable just putting in one number as my test case. Keep in mind that if you want to test things more thoroughly, you might want to think about doing more than just a single number to test it out. Our next example, we put spaces around our equal sign always. Our exponent gets replaced with 2 stars, and then we're multiplying x plus 2 times x to the 5th. The last operation that's going to happen is this multiplication, because in order of operations you always do parentheses first and then exponents and then multiplication and division. So the multiplication is last, that's where we put the spaces. And then let's not use x equals 10, let's use x equals 2, just because we're raising to the 5th power, so it's going to be a bigger number. We get 128, and that makes sense because 2 to the 5th is 32, 2 plus 2 is 4, and 4 times 32 is 128. That output is what we expect. Last, let's take this one. This needs relatively little tweaking. We have to add multiplication between the sets of parentheses to make Python understand this equation. We also need to put spaces in, so we'll put spaces around the equal sign. And then the lowest priority operation is the second multiplication, because when you're evaluating something with your order of operations, you go from left to right. And to test it, let's do something like x equals 5. X equals 2 is kind of a boring test because 2 minus 2 here will just be 0, so the whole output would be 0. And if x is 5, we'll expect output to be 4 times 3 times 2 is 24. And we did get the output we expect. So if you are ever given an equation that you need to put into Python, you do need to make sure that you know the order of operations, parentheses, exponents, multiplication and division, addition and subtraction. That is all for this lesson. I will see you next time.